Now, first of all, the speed at which AI is advancing, if you read, Stanford University has this report called The State of AI that you've probably read. And they've identified, over a couple of years, they've identified the speed by which AI is advancing. And so, of course, it's advancing across different dimensions at different speed, but generally speaking, it's advancing and it's doubling in price capacity every 5 months. Now, we've been talking about, Moore's Law for at least 20 years, and that's the doubling of price capacity every 18 months. So clearly, AI is moving faster than Moore's Law. And certainly you can see that AI, consumer AI, has been the fastest adopted technology in history.
Welcome to the Retailgentic podcast, where we explore the intersection of retail, e-commerce, and AI agents, which we call Retailgentic. Our mission is simple. We are shining a bright light on the new Agentic AI shopping megatrend, which will disrupt the trillion-dollar digital retail market. The stakes are high. Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, Perplexity, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Anthropic are all fighting to be the consumer AI shopping agent winner. There are going to be some tough decisions for online brands and retailers to make. What happens to checkout? How should payments work? Should you continue to invest in retail media networks? What does the world look like when over half of your traffic is not from humans, but from AI agents? These existential questions are the tip of the iceberg. On this podcast, we're talking to industry experts, analysts, and influencers to get answers to these questions, identify trends, and best practices. This is Retailgentic, your podcast partner in navigating our AI shopping agent future. And now here's your host, Scott Wingo.
Welcome back to the Retailgentic podcast. On today's episode, I am very excited to have Kasey Lobaugh as my guest. Kasey is chief futurist of the consumer industry at Deloitte, so he literally gets paid to have a crystal ball. Kasey spends his time talking to very large retailers and brands about their strategy, and in his chief futurist role, he spends time analyzing data and translating that into a point of view of the future and then strategies for Deloitte's clients to implement. Kasey is where I first heard about the great bifurcation, the separation between the value-oriented consumer and the convenience-oriented consumer. That led me down this path of starting a digital service business. We've had him on the Jason Scott show over 5 times, so I think that's a record as far as a guest on that show. And in this episode, Kasey brings some great insights and new thinking around our favorite topic, the intersection of retail and agentic commerce. He reveals there are 6 forces Deloitte sees impacting the consumer industry, and from there, Deloitte has built 250 trends that their clients they recommend to their clients to explore based on those 6 forces. In the episode, we talk about the consumer macro trends lightly, and then we tie those into what Kasey calls the predictive enterprise. That's more on the internal side about how you can leverage AI and agentic commerce, basically just agentic AI to optimize internal operations. Then we turn the discussion to the impact of GenAI's answer engines on retailers. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation with Kasey Lobaugh. He thinks out there a bit. I'm still kind of digesting the episode myself, so I hope you have that same experience where it really makes you think. Enjoy. Kasey Lobaugh, welcome to the Retailgentic podcast.
Hey, Scott. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. You're a long, I forget the count, 3 or 4 times on the Jason and Scott show?
I don't know. Yeah, let's go with
one
that.
Of our most frequent guests there. And you've, whenever I talk to you about what you guys are seeing, it ends up being life-changing. My whole company, number 4 Spiffy, was based off getting religion around you talking about the bifurcation and the value-oriented consumer and the convenience-oriented consumer. So you totally nailed that one. You were very, very early on that call. I think it was like 2010 or something. Yeah, and then you guys added a lot to it. So I was excited to get you back here and see what you guys are seeing about agentic commerce.
Yeah, sure. I have no shortage of things that we're seeing that we can talk about. So I'm thrilled to jump in.
Yeah, and let's give folks a little backgrounder of who you are if they're new to Kasey.
Sure. Sure. So first of all, I'm a principal at Deloitte, and I am in our consumer industry practice. I've my depth and expertise has really been in retail, and I've been with Deloitte now. I'm coming up on my 30th year with Deloitte, so I've been around Deloitte a long time. I helped to launch. I think I was one of the first 4 partners at Deloitte that launched Deloitte Digital. So I was doing e-commerce before we got really well organized around it. And of course, Deloitte Digital is a multi-billion-dollar portion of our business now. More recently, though, I took on this role, and this is probably where it gets sort of interesting, is this role I lead for our firm globally on behalf of all of our consumer industry clients, are what we call our Future of the Consumer Industry platform. So that gives me the opportunity to not only sort of research and try and understand what's happening that's impacting the consumer industry, but also I spend, probably 80% of my time in the market talking with executives about what we're seeing, what they're seeing, and what the implications are.
Got it. And are those mostly retailers, or do they also include brands and manufacturers? And I imagine, do you guys put commerce into kind of like over into travel and even maybe auto, and you have a pretty broad view of it? Okay.
That's right. So for consumer industry, for us, it includes, you can almost think about it as all consumer discretionary spending categories. That's maybe a little bit loose with the definition, but it certainly includes airlines and auto. It includes CPG manufacturers, retailers, transportation, hospitality. So there's quite a broad set of clients. And getting to spend time with that broad set of clients gives us perspective about where there's commonality. And that's kind of an interesting component that I'm coming away with. So while most of my career has really been focused on serving our clients in the retail space, for the last 3 years, I've been serving our consumer industry more broadly.
Got it. Well, cool. That's a good setup. Well, what are some of the things that are top of mind with your clients? So no, I won't ask you any individual client things, of course, but as you have these aggregated conversations, you start to see patterns. What's going on out there in the retail digital world?
Yeah. So here's what's interesting is that we're at this really unique period of time. This unique period of time where we have the breadth, the depth, the speed, of what's coming at us is really unprecedented. In fact, I'll use that term often, unprecedented. And I try not to be hyperbolic about any of it, but in some ways, when you start to look at it, it certainly becomes hyperbolic. Now, I'll start by just sort of framing up that the work that we've done has identified 6 big categories of forces, and I'll sort of lay those out, and we can talk about, well, how are our clients responding to those. But for us, the 6 forces impacting the future of the consumer industry certainly includes, number one, an unprecedented consumer. And I almost talk about this first category to really be about things that are not choices. So these are the things you might measure in a census, but those things are changing in ways that when you really dig into the data, I find out that executives broadly think they understand, but when you get into it, there's a lot of aha moments. The second category is really around society and culture changing. And this is certainly related to consumers changing, but society and culture are more about things that are choices. How are we choosing to spend our time? What are the choices we're making? Are we getting married and having children? Are we members of a religious establishment? Broad set of categories like this that are really about choices. And the reason that matters for us is because choice really matters in terms of what's your priority. How are you spending your money? What choices are you making in terms of spending that discretionary income? The third category is technology. We'll talk a lot about that today, but certainly a broad collection of technologies, AI being one of those. But frankly, we're seeing a lot where AI is actually speeding up other technologies, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that as well. Of course, as you dig deeper, the industry itself is really being disrupted. And by the way, all the sub sectors that I mentioned, the sectors I mentioned, are being disrupted in one way or another. And a lot of that has to do with just declining barriers to entry and what that does. Then there's the planet, climate, the energy revolution, the electrification of our economy. And finally, of course, a hot topic these days is government policy, power, politics. Kind of falls into 6 categories. So broad set of categories. And underneath that work, what we've done is we've surfaced over 250 unique, discrete trends, topics, industries, technologies, etc. And really that becomes the base of the research. So I spend time in the market talking to clients about those things, but probably more important, the convergence. Because it's easy for us to talk about any one thing. What's harder to identify are the risks and opportunities that come at the convergence of all these things that are changing across those 6 categories. So as I'm out there with clients, that's a long way to get to your question here. As we're out there with their clients, what's top of mind for them? Well, first of all, what's top of mind is that growth. Right? Consumer industry growth is top of mind always. It's the number one thing that we measure our companies on, and it's actually a real issue and a real topic for 2 reasons. One is if you just look at demographics, you look at population. We've always had more. What I mean by more, we've always had more. Population's always been growing. We've always had more GDP. We've always had more consumer spending. We've always had more workers. But when you look at the demographic data today, this idea about more is actually really in question, because the only real source of population growth we're seeing in the US, and by the way, it's not just US, it's all developed economies, is immigration. And of course, that then begins to conflict with some of the policies right now on immigration, where there's a question about, well, if that's the source of growth, if we're below the replacement rate, our birth rate is below the replacement rate, what happens to growth, right, when population begins to stagnate? That's sort of the first aspect. The second aspect, the reason growth comes up, is because I mentioned declining barriers to entry. Well, what happens when there's declining barriers to entry is a proliferation of choice, a proliferation of competitors. And so now you're taking what little growth there is and we're dividing up amongst more competitors. And that actually is constraining. And then the third thing I'll sort of layer on here is shifting category spending. So while there is certainly growth and in fact some hyper growth in some categories, well, it's not because that's net new growth. It's actually shifting away from other categories, traditional categories in many ways. So our executives find themselves in this position where they feel like, hey, this doesn't feel like a growth moment. This doesn't feel like a growth economy. And so how do we find growth and how do we think differently? Of course, the second topic I'll just hit on broadly, and I'm sure we're going to dig into this one, is really AI. How do I think about this? And I spend a lot of time with executives, not talking about it through a technical lens, but talking through it through a business lens. Because fundamentally, AI is about economics. It's about what are we able to do and how do we change the math and the formula behind that? And it really is a productivity unlock, but it's also an unlock around things that maybe we wouldn't have done before because they may have been economically constraining. So what I find is this economic conversation about AI is a refreshing and a new and a different conversation versus what I'll call the use case conversation. Because the use case conversation is there, and frankly, the list is long, and it's really tough to try and figure out what to go do. But suddenly, when you can raise it up to an executive level to talk about, well, what happens when economics of your business change, and how does that unlock or create risk for you? That suddenly opens up a different kind of conversation. So I'll just stop there at those sort of 2 big topics. Regardless if I'm with an airline, with a CPG company or a retailer, those 2 topics are sort of the prominent topics.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the first one, kind of on this, back on the consumer behavior, because that's always, to me, that's like our first principles, right? Like when Elon's building rockets, he's going into physics of the metal and gravity and that kind of thing. In our world, that is our physics, is the consumer. So you talked a lot about demographics, population, reduced barriers of entry, proliferation of choice. It sounds like we're going to be in this knife fight for share, both for the consumer's wallet, but then also your category. Where do people? Is that like a race to the bottom? Because you have this. Do you still believe in the value-oriented consumer, where that is going to be, largely? How do you become more efficient and, basically you're fighting against the TJ Maxx's and the dollar stores, and then over on the other side, is it? For the value-oriented consumer, is it more differentiated services? What framework do you give your folks to think through this?
Well, so you can certainly think about it through the economic framework of sort of what I've traditionally called the bifurcation of the economy. And there's a huge play right now for the value-oriented consumer that becomes increasingly important, particularly if you begin to look at ongoing inflation and what that does to a constrained wallet. But you have to sort of back up from there to understand the consumer and the economics of the consumer before you even get there. And one of the things that we uncovered that I found somewhat shocking, and like I never profess to know what anybody else knows. I can be very humble about what I thought I knew. So you and I, like you mentioned, I talked about the bifurcation of the economy, and that was always split by, let's call it high income and low income, or high net wealth and low net wealth. But what we discovered is there's something else that's happened, and it's really generational, wealth disparity. And what we find is, the numbers are just shocking. So I'll use an example. Actually, before I get there, what we see is the dramatic wealth creation that we've had over the last 15 years, coupled with dramatic wealth concentration. When you put those two things together and you look historically, it's never happened at this scale or this level of impact. And what has happened is really with baby boomer households. Baby boomer households have accumulated an unprecedented amount of wealth, and it's actually really starting to show up. So, for example, if you went back to 2005 and you looked at the 65-year and old cohort and older cohort of shoppers, that would have been the smallest contributing cohort of all the age cohorts to overall consumer spending. Today, that cohort is the largest contributing cohort. So it's not only this wealth creation, that's where the spending is now sort of concentrated, which is funny because many of my clients and, frankly, we probably were advising people of this was focus on the millennial, shift to the millennial, when the reality is the last 15 years, really owning that 65-year and old consumer was important. But when you dig into that and you find out why, it's because of asset appreciation, because of monetary policy and what's happened with housing and stocks. Well, who owns housing and stocks? It's the older consumer. So that actually separates the consumer into two categories. And I wouldn't call it high and low like we've traditionally done. I'd say we're talking about owners of assets and providers of labor. Two different categories. If you looked at the average wage, for the provider of labor, let's say go back to 1990, we're going to see that it's up about 23% or so, the wages. But if you go and you look at where wealth increase has come for the 65-year and older category, you're going to find that's north of 1,300%. So it's really, really disproportionate. And coupled with that, by the way, has been the disproportionate rise in non-discretionary categories like healthcare, housing, education. And those disproportionately impact the provider of labor or the lower income. So what this actually has created is a very unique economic time where we sort of have to recognize that the number of layers of diversity, and I'm going to use diversity broadly here, the number of layers of diversity is really amplified. So whether it's racial diversity, whether it's gender identity, whether it's age or income or wealth, we actually have to sort of recognize that the consumer themselves actually have fragmented pretty dramatically. And I layer all those together because historically we would have thought about the big middle class. Sometimes I like to think about it as a big bell curve. And our job is to, as retailers, is to sort of target that big middle portion of the market. But what happens is when you begin to fragment this, when you begin to change the needs, wants, and desires of people along these different dimensions of diversity, it actually creates opportunity, but it also creates a challenge. And that challenge is if we built our business for mass, right? It's tough to figure out how do I compete in that environment, and particularly when the barriers to entry fall. And now I've got competitors who are picking off these various segments, in different ways. So I went down a long path of sort of information that sort of gets us to this point to say we actually have to begin to think very differently. Not even sort of simplistically along bifurcation. We have to think very differently about who's the consumer, what do they need, want, and desire, and how do we build our businesses that enable us to have that level of flexibility to deliver on that diverse set of needs.
Mm-hmm. What's like a tactical, in my head, I'm imagining a marketing campaign that's like, welcome asset owners, but that's like not very tactical. What are some examples of how you can
Oh, sure.
execute on that.
Yeah. So here's what's interesting is these things converge. Remember I said the risks and opportunities live at the convergence of things that are moving. On one hand, I just described an environment that said we were all built, our consumer industry was built for mass. Okay. But I said the market is fragmenting. Historically, why were we built for mass? Well, we were built for mass because historically we had economic constraints called economies of scale. And so it was very difficult for us to build businesses that had a high degree of uh, relevance or personalization or whatever the word you want, like a high degree of variance in that. However, now we're going to enter in with AI because what's happening on the AI front, and it's a bit mind blowing, is the economics are changing, meaning the things that kept us from delivering on a more flexible business were economic constraints. Well, those economic constraints are actually going away. So what's that mean when you put those two together? It means that we can actually begin to think about how our businesses are built and how they need to be built differently. So to get to a tactical example, I use a retail example. One of the things we find is a pretty significant bump in revenue when you can localize assortment. So the store closest to me, the store, I'm in Kansas City, South Kansas City. If somebody's in North Kansas City and South Kansas City, what you find out is like, oh, the needs, wants, and desires of those consumers shouldn't be considered the same. In fact, we should have a way to be able to predict in a more specific way what's the exact right assortment that needs to go in each individual store. And using technology, we can do that. And what we find out is being more relevant in this kind of environment is actually a requirement. So that idea about becoming more relevant shows up, and certainly it shows up in marketing, but it also shows up in operations. And this is the part I try and get to, is that a lot of people think about personalization, but I'm talking about the entire business model that has hyper-relevance. And hyper-relevance means, oh, my supply chain is built for this. My assortment planning, my merchandising is built for this. My unique offerings, my service capabilities are built for this level of relevance. So hopefully that's a good example about how those things come together and create opportunity.
I imagine you have to be very adaptable too, because suddenly Taylor Swift and Kelsey get engaged, and the Kansas City stores all need more, another wave of Taylor stuff or something.
Yeah. I've heard the news is all a buzz here, by the way. Yeah, that's right. Like in some ways, what we refer to this as becoming the predictive enterprise. Okay, which is actually, that word, let's talk about that for a minute, because our clients use the word, often they'll use the word insight. And I try and delineate the difference between insights and predictive. And it becomes important because what you just said is to be agile. We've been saying this in retail forever, right? What she wants, when she wants it, where she wants it. Well, inherent in that is a predictive capability. I have to be able to predict what she wants, when she wants it, where she wants it. And the difference between insights and predictive insights, is first of all, it tends to be humans staring at data, trying to explain what happened, because it's all historic data. And then they put it in PowerPoint slides and sort of walk it around and try and convince people to make different business decisions because they got some insight. All right. So now if I move out to predictive is not human hypothesis led, right? We're trying to figure out what are the predictive attributes that actually should predict what should the assortment be, what should inventory deployment be. And, predict now with computing power and AI, we can actually identify predictive attributes. And I've got great examples of predictive attributes where it's sort of mind blowing. Like, I can't believe that's predictive of something, but it is. But that's the difference is we move from this sort of insights driven organization to a predictive. We move from looking backwards to looking forward. We move from being human hypothesis led to being compute power led in our ability to drive that level of predictive nature. And so one of the things we do, Scott, for our clients is we take all this information, those 250 things, and we say, where are the risks and opportunities? And what's it tell us about where there are risks and opportunities unique to your organization? And out of that comes some pretty big themes. And one of those themes I just mentioned is becoming a predictive enterprise. And that means that you're compute led, we have broad sets of data, and we also embed this directly into business processes. So there is no human walking around with a PowerPoint trying to convince people that they discovered something interesting. If you think about social media, there's an algorithm that feeds up what is relevant for you. There's no human hypothesis. There's no PowerPoint deck, right? And so that's why I try and
the tastemaker king is dead.
yeah, I try and call that distinction because while the word predictive sounds like, yeah, I got a data and analytics group that are doing insights, you're like, no, we're talking about apples and oranges, and we got to be clear about that.
Yeah. Can you give us an example that's kind of generic of some data that led to a predictive thing?
Oh, sure.
It's kind of like a freakonomics kind
of.
Yeah,
this is absolutely one of those. Yeah. So this is for, let's just say, department store retailer. Okay. And the question was, what's predictive of a new consumer who's going to show up for the first time? We'd love to be able to identify consumers that we think have a high propensity to become new shoppers. That's basically it. So we've at Deloitte, we've got this really incredible set of data that we compiled over time. We call it converged consumer, but just think we go into the market, we acquire every piece of data we possibly can, we stitch it together, and then we allow the AI models to discover where are their predictive signals. And that's certainly credit card transactions, but it's also a whole bunch of health and wellness, economic data, et cetera. So we run this model. Like what is predictive of a new consumer showing up? The question was, did they buy a cat? Did they buy a cat? Now, by the way, it wasn't that by itself, but it's a whole collection of these topics. But this, did they buy a cat, was actually really predictive of someone who's going to show up for the first time as a brand new consumer. Now, of course, the human brain wants to go, okay, why is that? And is that logical? And we would go, it doesn't matter. Like this is it. The data tells us this is predictive, right? So this idea, now translate that back, by the way, to how retailers have traditionally operated. They all have segments, and segments are defined by a collection of attributes. Okay, how did you come up with those attributes? Are those predictive? And what are they predictive of? And what you'll discover is traditionally, the way we've come up with segments, largely, is a human hypothesizes a collection of attributes that they think make good logical sense. But if this new model, what you'd say is, no, we're going to let the data, the predictive data, tell us what the segments really are. What are the predictive attributes that put someone in a particular segment that represent needs, wants, or desires? And in this case, we'd go instead of women that live in the suburbs that make 100,000. That's sort of the traditional approach. But imagine, the people who just bought a cat being one of your segments. That's an example of one of these sort of economic things.
Very cool. All right, let's. Anything else on the consumer side you want to hit on before we go into kind of the overall AI side?
Yeah. So one of the things that I find really, really fascinating is the changing gender sort of impacts on the consumer. And if you look at, of course, I could tell you that the role that women are playing in our economy is changing, and we would probably all shake our head and say, "Yep, I understand that." But when you really get into it, there's one piece of shocking information after another. And by the way, this is again shocking to me. Again, I don't know what you know and what you don't know. But one of the things I discovered was that there is a major shift coming in terms of who owns wealth. Who owns wealth? And you almost have to step back for a minute and recognize 300,000 years of Homo sapiens where it's been a patriarchy, where men have now, in my house, women get to control the wealth. But, look, we come from this position, right, where it's been a patriarchy. Okay, so now if you look at 2019, women owned about 45% of the total wealth in the U.S., and so they're sort of tracking along. By 2030, the projections are that women are going to own over 62% of the wealth in the United States. Over 62%. Now, for me, that's shocking. Okay, that's a pretty significant shift in a relatively short period of time. That then translates down to a lot of other things, like now, today, more women are head of household than men. And that's flipped recently. Of course, it also shows up in sole households. It has to do with careers. There's a lot of things sort of wrapped up in that. But it's sort of interesting to look at it. But one of the biggest drivers I already mentioned was this massive wealth creation with baby boomer households. When you really look at how disproportionate it is, for me, it's shocking. The sheer amount of wealth that's been created by the baby boomer generation will find its way into this path. And that's because statistically speaking, baby boomers are married. And statistically speaking, the man's going to pass away before the woman. And when you take that and you just flow it forward, it becomes very clear what's happening here. Now, it's not the only thing happening, because right now women are enrolling in college 60-40 to men, and that's been happening for a while. And by the way, if you looked at who's graduating, it only gets more pronounced, because not only are women enrolling, they go on to graduate at a higher rate. So when you put all these things together, what it shows is this real sort of significant shift that's in front of us that we have to really begin to think about. How does that translate down to society, culture, spending, priorities, and then how's that going to shape our industry?
Yeah, it doesn't. I follow the stocks of the beauty companies, Ulta and Sephora, and you can tell that they're just up and to the right.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's definitely a surge of women buyers of all things out there.
Yep, for sure.
Let's pivot over to AI and Agentic. So I'm imagining you spend a lot of time on the operational side. For our podcast, we talk more about the consumer's use of GenAI and that kind of thing. I'm also interested in the operational side, but I could see already how it could help with this predictive unlock and all the things you're talking about, and also tons of other productivity unlocks that you could have at the store level. I'm hearing from all the retail executives I talk to that they're definitely seeing this huge decline in Google traffic, which is freaking them out, because that's kind of been a bit of a gravy train, especially the free organic stuff for a while. So SEO is like really kind of tipped over, and even SEM is, because as Google adds more AI and more answers, there's less clicks off the page, which is a response to ChatGPT taking share from them. So it's kind of this dominoes are falling. Do you hear that kind of thing, or you're more you tend to be more like strategic and talk about these intersections of changes and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I certainly hear about that, but I would say that our conversation, the ones that I'm engaged in, tend to be a bit more strategic. And I'll sort of share some of the conversation that we have that I bring to the executives I spend time with. Now, first of all, the speed at which AI is advancing, if you read, Stanford University has this report called The State of AI that you've probably read. And they've identified, over a couple of years, they've identified the speed by which AI is advancing. And so, of course, it's advancing across different dimensions at different speed, but generally speaking, it's advancing and it's doubling in price capacity every 5 months. Now, we've been talking about, Moore's Law for at least 20 years, and that's the doubling of price capacity every 18 months. So clearly, AI is moving faster than Moore's Law. And certainly you can see that AI, consumer AI, has been the fastest adopted technology in history. That data exists out there. But you've got to sort of get your head around this 5 months versus 18 months, because that has huge implications. And I try and explain it this way. If you thought about a 5-year horizon, so our clients are doing strategies over the next 5 years, and you thought about doubling every 18 months of that price capacity of computing power, at the end of 5 years, you'd be 10x where you started. If you double every 5 months over a 5 year,
because it compounds, you can't just add it. Right?
That's right. Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yeah. And so if you're advancing every 5 months, you're actually over 4,000x by the end of 5 years. Now, it's kind of hard to even imagine what doubling looks like. Like, how do I comprehend doubling? And I do some examples for our clients, and there's some good examples out there about sort of visually seeing what some of the image generators have looked like every 3 months, every 4 months, every 5 months, and how they're doubling. So we try and bring that to life, but that has real implications for how we have to think about the speed by which our world is advancing. The other thing I mentioned already, economics. Look, there's some studies out already that show things like computer programming using large language model capabilities can be up to 50% more productive. Writing memos and policies. There's one study I saw that says 30% more productive. And you sort of have to stop and recognize that's massive. That is massive. I mean, if it's half that, it's still massive. If it was 5%, it's massive, because computer programming is $1 trillion job in our economy, right? That is a massive economic unlock that it's already possible today. Now, double that. Now, double it again. And it really becomes sort of hard to get your head around, like, well, what do I do and how do I begin to position against something that's moving this fast that has this level of power? Now, you can think about that both from from an economic standpoint, yeah, certainly there's efficiency opportunities, and there's like just unlocking that efficiency I just gave you in those two stats. We could probably spend the next 5 years just trying to unlock that efficiency that I just mentioned. But it's not just efficiency, it's actually innovation. Because what if coding was much more accessible? What if coding, and I've done this myself using some of the vibe coding apps, produced applications where I myself did no coding, zero coding? Now, what happens when the cost of innovation plummets like that? What happens to the market? What happens to consumer options? What happens to innovation? You have to think about that as well. And then on the flip side, we have to think about the consumer and how that changes what the consumer uses and what the consumer values. And I put both of those out there. Certainly the consumer use, you already mentioned it. The data is already there. There's a shift happening right now from search to more advanced ways to do discovery. But it's discovery, it's evaluation, it's influence, and suddenly search kind of feels fairly narrow in its ability to hit on those. But the large language models actually feel very broad in their ability to hit a broader set of those important sort of factors. So that shift's underway. But more than that, what we talk to our clients about is the growth of digital services. We've already measured this, right? We've measured the growth of digital goods and services. We know already that digital goods and services make up about 11% of the consumer's discretionary wallet. And that's before really the large language model kind of Gen AI capabilities are in people's hands. So think about things like multimodal AI today. It's possible today, which is something like interior decorating, right? Today, my wife might hire an interior decorator. I don't know how much it's per hour. I probably don't want to know how much it is per hour. But the ability to just hold up my phone and turn on the camera and use an AI that I can talk with, just like they were human, that can produce Gen AI interior decorating ideas, suddenly changes that market. That market changes. And by the way, if you're a retailer and you're in the furniture business, that probably is pretty relevant. And it might even be opportunity because, as you mentioned, race to the bottom, meaning our margins are becoming increasingly squeezed. We have to find new ways to generate revenue. We have to find new ways to generate margin. And certainly we've known for a long time that services is one of those sort of categories we should be paying attention to. But when I begin to play that forward, it just blows open the opportunities for the consumer to access services, broad range of services. I used interior decorator, but we could go with personal workout. We could go financial advisor. We could go veterinarian services, right? Broad set of services that are about to come online that will matter in terms of consumer spending. They'll change the market, but they probably also matter in terms of those three steps I mentioned: discovery, right? Influence, and information that we're sort of trying to figure out, well, how should I spend my money on what's important to me? So I actually believe that we're at the very beginnings of some pretty dramatic and radical change that's going to come to the consumer market more broadly.
Yeah, let's kind of make that tactical again. So, what am I to do if I'm a retailer? Offer my own digital services, or make sure I'm involved in the ones that are going to be offered? Or
well, so I'd say, of course, the answer is yes. So on one hand, we have to think about, how does our brand and our offering show up, to the large language models? Okay. Because those are our primary source now. Like, how do we show up there? And and of course, there's probably going to be a whole market that emerges, just like there was in, search optimization around, well, what your web pages have to be and do and see and be capable of in order to be more exposed and to find themselves, into these models. So that's probably a component of it. There's a component of it that says, well, why would I assume that I'm going to let someone else be the influencer, right? If somebody comes to me, and I use the furniture, store as an example, if I want to be all things furniture, then maybe I ought to think about what my offering looks like that really allows the consumer to think about me first, not just for, hey, they've got the stuff, but they've got the expertise. They've got the perspective, they've got the influence, they've got the knowledge, right? That suddenly becomes kind of interesting to think about that. And then the third piece would be what we just talked about is, well, what are the services in and around your product that maybe already exist, but maybe you're just not playing in them? So, for example, you might be, a shoe manufacturer for running shoes, and you've got a prominent brand in running shoes. But today, if someone wants to train to run a marathon, they don't think that you're the source of that expertise for them. Well, maybe you should be, right? And what has to happen for that to be the case? Where are there revenue opportunities, or where are there just opportunities to be, more present so that you're more influential in that process?
What are some other things that you're thinking about with AI? So one thing, there's information that the Financial Times put out there that ChatGPT is going to have a checkout. And as a marketplace person, that makes me excited because one of my early theories was there's a path where these basically, because they have so much consumer distribution, they want to own the transaction. But that creates an interesting situation and always has for retailers. The Amazon one was more complicated because you had a clear frenemy, right? Because they were a 1P, they were competing with you and had a marketplace. ChatGPT is never going to go build a retail operation. Never say never, but I think that's highly unlikely. So there'll be kind of a pure play marketplace, not unlike eBay, but without the baggage that eBay has. eBay's kind of got its whole auction baggage, and it's more of a value-oriented kind of a play. What do you think about that? And if that happens, then it's a fight for who owns the customer and all the goodies that happen at checkout, the personalization, the loyalty programs, and those kinds of things, and even some dynamic pricing. Like, how are you going to do a couponing or a BOGO or any of that kind of stuff if there's this kind of piece coming between you and the consumer?
Yeah, no, I think that we're already on this path of who owns the interaction with the consumer, who's first, and how do you not get disintermediated? Like, we've been on this path for 20 plus years, right? The path only becomes more complex now. And one of the things I've always thought, since we started, like when you and I first met, 20 some years ago, right, was this idea that said at some point there has to be this this data structure that allows these various front ends to operate against a pool of available inventory that isn't proprietary, right? Mm-hmm. And for the longest time, we had these various consortiums that were talking about XML constructs, and well, that's interesting. But one of the things large language models does for us is says, "Oh, I don't need those."
Yeah.
Right. So that becomes interesting to say, oh, and I saw this today, and I won't say this. You're welcome to talk about this. But I saw, one of the big online marketplaces now says, no, we're building not just an AI in our storefront. We're building an AI that's agentic. So if we don't have it, we'll go buy it from somebody else. And so this ability to navigate, this ability to piece information together and do things on your behalf, that's effectively what we're talking about. And so that's going to become incredibly complex. And by the way, one of the interesting things, I find this debate is back again. I remember this debate
with e-commerce. It was like, I don't want them I don't want that online thing coming. I don't want Google coming between me and my customer.
That's well. And so do you remember when there was this debate? I remember I wrote an article, and this is years ago, called "The Case for In-Store Wi-Fi." And the case was, look, if they'll give you your email address, that's worth a lot of money to you. So give them Wi-Fi. Back then, the argument was, I don't want my customers to have access to internet when they're in my store because they're just going to go shop my competitor. And there was a whole lot of, I don't know if you remember that, right? There was like this debate about, can we scramble the signal while they're inside our store? And I don't want them to do that. Of course.
Can I block competitors?
Yeah. And then ultimately, of course, that went away because the consumer, has access. Okay. Now the same debate seems to be back, which is, I'm going to block agents from, navigating my page. I'm going to block this. I'm going to block that. I'm going to block the other. I don't believe that will be any more successful than blocking Wi-Fi in my store. So I actually think it's the opposite, which is, this is happening. You better start to strategize on how you're going to win in the age of this happening versus I just don't want this to happen. That may be a short-term strategy, but it is not a long-term strategy in my mind.
Yeah, the head in the sand thing has not worked out well for folks that ignored these sea changes. The people that like really leaned into it have tended to not only survive but thrive.
Yeah, yeah. Now, when I talk to people, Scott, this is interesting. On one hand, of course, in the e-commerce, growing up in e-commerce and sort of leading our retail e-commerce practice for a long time, I heard over and over again where there were executives that would explain to me why their category. I get books, but shoes, you can't do shoes online, or you can't do dresses. And it was one after another. I heard the same story over and over again, and so it was this sort of pessimism about why this doesn't make sense. Now, what I hear about AI in particular, I hear blockchain. Oh, yeah, yeah. Or I'll hear VR. Yeah, yeah. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, everybody was hot on VR, and see where that went. Everybody was hot on blockchain, see where that went. And they use that as sort of this justification for AI is just the next hot thing. We're going to go down the same path. Of course, only the future, will tell us that. But every time I hear that level of pessimism comes from somebody, I think back to those days of like, why this won't work, why my category, just doesn't make sense. So I'm always challenging that and sort of pushing, on whether or not there's a more logical framework to understand what works and why, and what becomes buzzy and fails and why. And I think that's the more critical thinking we have to put against trying to understand where all this heads.
Yeah, those two didn't have 800 million active users, so there's a big difference there.
Yeah, for sure.
That,
Well,
yeah,
to me, it's sort of simple. Like, here's the simple litmus test. Okay, average Joe, go build an application on the blockchain. Okay, all right, average Joe, go run a query, against a large language model. Okay, there's for me, there's the answer. Or the same thing could be true for VR, because the hurdle, right, to actually have what you need, know how to run it, feel confident in it, it was pretty high.
yeah, it still is. Yeah, even if you have them, just like every time you pick it up, it's like a 30-minute setup again.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you have to update all the new software. Yeah, for sure.
What about on the store operations? You probably have like 300 different use cases. What are some like the top five? I always read a lot about customer service agents and those types of things. Is that overblown? Is that really working? What's working in the spectrum in there?
I try and stay out of the use case kind of conversation. I would tell you that, when I talk to CEOs, the problem isn't what could you do, because as soon as you start to recognize what the capabilities are, it's everywhere, it's everything. Then you've got to get down to but what should I do? And therein lies your question, and the harder question. And it actually can vary. And we've seen some, like some great results we've seen off of some early pilots, but it's probably still a little early to say this always works, for retail, etc. Yeah.
Operationally, any interesting stories or like,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I think this idea about creativity is really interesting, about how creativity gets unlocked. Because I mentioned earlier, like, there's this economic lens that says it's all about efficiency. But what actually is happening to me in my own personal life is there's this creativity unlock that suddenly happens to us. I'll use an example. And I did this, of course, Scott, I've been into music for many, many years. I've started to use some of the AI music apps, which are getting pretty advanced now. And I've got, from years ago when I played music, I had booklets full of lyrics, and I had guitar riffs that I never made into a song. And I can now very quickly do something with those. And I think about that not as like efficiency. While yes, it's more efficient, I wouldn't have done anything with those, because it was way too costly for me to get a group of guys and girls together as musicians to write music, to go to a studio, to get a producer. And suddenly that's all changing. So we almost have this abundance of our ability to create. And we're actually seeing that. In fact, we've got some cases we've done for some CPG companies that are producing food. So you can take in a bunch of information around needs, wants, and desires of consumers. you can input a bunch of constraints around machinery and production lines and, what you have to work with. And out of that, you can generate really, really creative ideas around different things that you can make on your machinery, on your production line, that suddenly our ability to generate net new ideas skyrockets.
Yeah. Yeah, almost like one product per consumer kind of a stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So remember I said this is the crazy part, because it's so fundamental to our industry, is like we were built for mass because of economic constraints. Well, when the marginal cost of complexity plummets, when the marginal cost of creativity plummets, then suddenly the business model is different and it unlocks something very, very different. Now that's hard for, big established organizations to go, how do I change? Okay, that's hard. That's really hard. Now, of course, for younger, more nimble organizations, it's much easier for them to say, oh, how do I do this? And how do I take advantage of that? And of course, coupled with that is that many of the things that we've traditionally thought as business capabilities that were embedded in humans are becoming digitizable. And we've been on this path, right? So you know this as well as anybody. If you wanted to start a retailer, you didn't have to have all of the infrastructure, that you once did. You didn't have to have like army of employees and leases and stores and trucks, and like you could actually get up and running as a retailer and subscribe to a set of capabilities, right? That would enable you in the marketplace. Well, what we're seeing very rapidly is this waterline of what those capabilities look like is advancing very quickly. And therefore, things like what I just described are becoming available. So in the model where you go, oh, I have to have my own studio and my own producer, and I have to have my own mixing board, and I have to have, you go, no, don't need those anymore. I can just sign up for the platform. In my example, where we're talking about creativity of recipes, you can build it yourself. Good luck in trying to keep up with, because in 5 months, the price capacity of that's going to double. In 5 more months, it's going to double. Good luck in building it and keeping up with that. And alternatively, we start to think about, well, how do I just sign up for the platform that they're going to keep up with that? And then my job is, how do I unlock value with that platform, instead of thinking, oh, it's my job to build that infrastructure. So that's another interesting unlock that's before us.
Yeah. Let's leave with kind of another tactical thing. Let's say you're at a retailer or a brand. You want to kind of figure out what to do about AI. Do you have a playbook? Is it form a SWAT team? Is it an executive retreat? Is it no, it has to be part of the DNA of the company? Like what are some bullets you would say to someone in that kind of at that early phase?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because what teams want to do, what organizations want to do, is form a task force, generate use cases, and start identifying which use case you're going to go after. What we would suggest you start with is with executive education. And I don't mean education like, hey, have a technology vendor come in and show you. To me, it's more about, how is the industry itself changing? What are the implications on our business model? What are the implications on our people? What are implications on how I have to think about our strategy? That's where you've got to start there, because if our executives don't understand that, then they don't really understand what we're trying to do. The other interesting thing, and I've sort of alluded to this, and I know, Scott, you always try and pull me to be more tactical and practical in my conversations, but my brain, thinks about things maybe a little differently than yours does, which always makes a fun conversation. But to me, it's like this. We're on this labor curve, cost curve of labor. And if you look, we've been outsourcing labor to India and other places, and the cost of that labor has been going up by 7%, 9%. So that's a cost curve. You can sort of see it trajectory up. Even in the US, it's a trajectory up. Meanwhile, the cost curve associated with technology is plummeting, right? Every 5 months, half. 5 months, half. 5 more months, half that, okay? Now draw those two, if you can, in your head. Now, the problem that I see is most of the use cases that we're talking about when we start down the use case path is an attempt to bend the labor curve. I have humans that are doing some stuff. Okay, we'll augment this. We'll give them this. And the bigger opportunity might be, okay, that's fine, but where might I actually move to the other cost curve? So to me, there's a difference between bending a cost curve and moving to the other cost curve. And you heard me say words like platform. Like when I move from a team of 10 people doing Insight PowerPoint generation, when I move from that to being a predictive enterprise where the algorithm is on a platform that's embedded in my business process, guess what? That is now on a different cost curve than my humans who are trying to figure out how to use AI tools and capabilities to, to be more efficient in their job. Okay. So part of what we're trying to do at that executive level is like, let's think about how we've got to think about this strategically and not just, hey, which job are we going to make somewhat more efficient? And it's not that that doesn't exist and that's not important. You should absolutely do that. But the problem is that the industry right now is really being disrupted dramatically, right? And therefore, we've actually got to think bigger thoughts than we would think about. There's in our RPA use case. We've been talking about RPA for years too, right?
Yeah, and I think that's you don't think of it as tactical. To me, it's a path to the tactical, right? Like people sometimes have a hard time connecting the dots with these big strategic things to like, oh my God, what do I do? But, hopping the cost curves makes sense. That scares people because it feels like it's bad for people and they're going to lose their jobs. But, I've built at my startup, I had 800 people, and there was like 100 people I wish weren't doing busy work because I could put them on more strategic things. But at the end of the day, we had to deliver all these spreadsheets and we had no way of automating it. So, you had like these brilliant 80K people just like in the bowels of a spreadsheet all day.
This is the takeaway I hope anybody that's listening takes from this conversation is that like the world's changing really dramatically. And that risks and opportunities live at the intersection of these various things. But don't think about this purely as an efficiency kind of play or efficiency opportunity, because what I've described is we're unleashing capability of humans. I really, truly believe that.
It's like you and the music.
My music example is like, I don't have less to do.
Yeah, no one lost their job. It was additive. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have less to do. I have more to do today because suddenly I can do more. I could do things that I couldn't do yesterday because of economic constraints, right? So suddenly I can do more. So let's reimagine our organizations. Let's reimagine how we serve the consumer, not, the race to the bottom, but let's race to the top. Let's race to unlocking this world of abundance that we're getting ready to find ourselves in.
Well, Kasey, I want to be observant of your time. You've been very generous. I appreciate it. It's going to take me like 3 days to process this. It always takes me a while to kind of like unpack all the stuff you throw out. So really appreciate you giving me something to do over Labor Day weekend. So
Perfect.
I appreciate that.
Yes. Hey, Scott, it's always great to connect with you. I'm up for conversations with you or anybody anytime that we want to have interesting conversations.
Sounds good. Well, I'll have to check in with you after about 5 months because at that point it'll be a whole new world. So we're going to have to get on a 5-month schedule now that we're on the AI time.
That's perfect.
Thanks again, and you have a great weekend.
All right. See you, Scott.
Follow, rate, and share to stay up to date with Retailgentic, your guide to the future of AI shopping agents.